Tonight, we're going to drift through a collection of quiet, unsettling stories, told slowly so you can rest and let your mind wander. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Just listen and let the stories carry you. In the misty hills and shadowed glens of Scotland, the old legends linger, whispered from one generation to the next. Tonight we'll explore 3 terrifying tales, stories of creatures, killers, and omens that have haunted these lands for centuries. Bav the blood-sucking fairy. She looks like a beautiful woman in a flowing green dress until it's far too late. The Bav are vampiric fairies said to lure travellers into secluded woods and feed upon their blood. According to legend, a group of Highland hunters once wished aloud for female company. That night, 4 beautiful women appeared, and by morning, 3 of the men were dead, their bodies pale and bloodless. Even today, wandering alone in the Highlands at night could draw the attention of these deadly, otherworldly beings. Some say the forests themselves remember these events. A shadow in the trees, a whisper in the wind, and those who pass may feel the chill of eyes that do not belong to this world. Sawney Bean and the Cannibal Clan. Far from the quiet woods of the Highlands, along the jagged Ayrshire coast, lived Alexander Sawney Bean and his family in the 16th century. For 25 years they ambushed travellers, murdered them, and devoured their flesh, hiding the remains in the cliffs and sea. Over 1,000 souls are said to have vanished at their hands. Eventually the stench gave them away. When the clan was caught, every member was executed without trial. Yet the caves still whisper their secrets. Some claim the ghosts of Sawney Bean and his kin roam the cliffs, waiting for the unwary who wander too close to the shore. And if the trees of the Highlands could watch the coastal caves, they might shudder at the echoes of a family whose appetite knew no bounds. The Benea, the washerwoman of death. Rivers and streams across Scotland hide their own terrors. You'll hear her before you see her, a solitary figure washing blood-stained clothes in a quiet stream. This is the Benea, the washerwoman of death. She foretells who is soon to die. If she washes your garments, your time has come. But if you dare approach unnoticed and seize her before she sees you, she must reveal whose death she is preparing, and might even grant a wish. The water ripples under her hands, carrying centuries of sorrow, and travellers swear the silence that follows her presence is heavier than any storm. From misty moors to flowing streams, the legends of Scotland intertwine, leaving a trail of whispers, shadows, and lingering fear. So as the mist curls over the hills and the wind whispers through the glens, these legends linger still. The past is never truly gone. It waits quietly in the shadows, in the stories, and in the night. And as the mist settles over the hills and the whispers of the past fade into the night, humanity's fear of the unknown takes a darker, more chilling form. Not just stories of spirits or haunted forests, but tales of the living dead, of blood drinkers walking among the living, lingering in our nightmares. Across Europe and even America, such fears once gripped entire communities, and the shadow of the vampire stretched long and wide. Peter Blagojevich, Serbia, 1725. In the remote village of Kiseljevo, Serbia, a man named Peter Blagojevich died, and then the villagers claimed he returned. Just 8 days after his passing, 9 people in the village mysteriously perished, each whispering the same chilling words. Peter had come to them in the night, choking them in their sleep. Even his own wife fled, haunted by the memory of her husband appearing at her door, asking for his shoes. The villagers were paralyzed by fear, and in desperation, they exhumed his body. What they saw sent shivers through their very souls. His corpse was unusually fresh. Hair and nails had grown, and dark, sticky blood coated his lips. Terrified, the villagers did what any 18th century people might have done in such a horror. They drove a stake through his heart and burned his body. Word of Peter's dark return spread far beyond Kiseljevo, reaching newspapers in Austria and igniting a panic that swept across Europe. Even now, one can imagine the quiet Serbian night, the wind whispering through the trees, and the shadow of Peter lingering where once he walked. But Peter's story was only one chapter in a much larger tale of fear and superstition. Across the ocean, in the quiet towns of America, another kind of horror gripped the living. Mercy Brown, Rhode Island, 1892. In Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892, tuberculosis swept silently through the Brown family, leaving sorrow in its wake. First the mother, then the daughter Mary Olive, and finally Mercy Brown herself. As illness claimed her family, whispers began. Something unnatural was draining the life from the living. When Mercy's brother Edwin fell gravely ill, the villagers decided they must act. They exhumed the bodies of the dead, searching for a source of the disease, and found Mercy's corpse unnervingly preserved. Her cheeks still held a flush of life, her body seeming almost alive. In desperate fear, they removed her heart and burned it, mixing the ashes into a potion that Edwin drank. It was a cure of sorts, born from terror, but it was not enough. Edwin, too, succumbed to the illness, and Mercy Brown became forever remembered as New England's last vampire. Her tale a chilling echo of how fear can shape the dead and the living alike. And then there was Arnold Powley. His story was so unsettling, so darkly persistent, that it shaped the vampire folklore we know today. Arnold Powley, Serbia, 1726 to 1730s. Arnold Powley, a soldier, claimed he had been attacked by a vampire while in Greece. He performed rituals to cure himself, rituals that seemed to keep death at bay for a time. But after Arnold eventually passed away, the nightmare returned. Villagers began to die mysteriously. Whispers of his spectral presence spread through the night air. His body was dug up and examined. Once again, it appeared unnaturally fresh, with blood still dark and sticky around his lips. He was staked and burned, yet even that was not the end. Years later, deaths continued, blamed upon those who had eaten meat from animals that had fed on the undead. The panic grew so widespread that Austrian authorities intervened, documenting everything meticulously. Their records would become the foundation for the classic vampire as we imagine it today. One can almost hear the forests of Serbia at night, the wind carrying the murmurs of the dead, the fear of villagers etched into every stone and stream, a reminder of how thin the line between life and death once seemed. From the darkened highlands to the coastlines of Ayrshire, from rivers in Rhode Island to the shadowed forests of Serbia, the tales of vampires and monsters intertwine with our fears, with the unknown, and with the endless human fascination with what may lurk just beyond sight. And so, the stories continue. The night stills around you, and though the vampires may have retreated to their graves, the world remains quietly alive with other spirits. Not all hauntings are as personal, close, or bloody as the tales of Peter, Mercy, or Arnold. Some linger in the stones of ancient castles, in the shadows of homes marked by tragedy, in tombs sealed for millennia, and tunnels beneath entire cities. If you listen carefully, you might hear them too. Drifting whispers, soft footsteps in empty halls, a chill in the air where no wind blows. These are the echoes of lives cut short, of sorrow and fear, and of stories that refuse to end. As you sink deeper into this quiet, dreamlike world, let us wander next to the places where the dead do not rest, and the haunted past stretches across centuries and continents. From violent spirits to despairing souls, let us now drift into the tales of 5 of the most haunted places in the world. 1. Edinburgh Castle, Scotland. Perched on top of a crag and tail, formed by a glacier many thousands of years ago, Edinburgh Castle is both a beautiful and formidable sight. Having seen its fair share of bloodshed, it is no surprise that it is one of the most haunted places in the world. The Grey Lady, a spirit that wanders the ground weeping, is thought to be the ghost of Janet Douglas, who was burned at the stake in 1537 in front of her son for a baseless accusation of treason and witchcraft, in an act of revenge against her husband by a vengeful King James V. She drifts through the corridors like a pale mist, her tears falling silently, her white gown fluttering as if caught on a wind no one else can feel. Her sorrow seems to seep into the very stones of the castle. There are also reports of a violent ghost, who is the spirit of a prisoner kept in the dank, rat-infested dungeon. He tried to escape in a barrow full of dung, thinking it would be transported out of the castle. But instead it was thrown over the battlements, smashing him to pieces on the cliffs below. His spirit is said to rise like a shadowy figure, glowing faintly in the darkness, bringing with him the stench of manure and a terrifying presence that pushes visitors toward the edge of the cliffs. Two, Amityville House, USA. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his family while they slept in the Long Island town of Amityville. The Lutz family later bought the house at a drastically reduced price, but only lasted 28 days living there before fleeing in terror. While they lived there, George, the father, would wake up every night at 3:15, which was the exact time of the murders. Strange odours drifted through the rooms like invisible fingers. Green slime oozed out of the walls and keyholes, and cold spots appeared in the corners, moving with a will of their own. When a priest was called, he heard a voice scream, "Get out!" Shadows slithered across walls, levitation occurred, and a pig-like creature with red eyes seemed to watch silently from the darkened corners. The house itself felt alive, breathing slowly, holding on to the memory of the blood spilled within, refusing to release those who entered. Three, Tower of London, England. The grim and foreboding Tower of London is famous for its dark and cold dungeons, torture and beheading, which means there are no shortage of disgruntled ghosts. A total of 13 ghosts have been identified in the tower. These include the famous figure of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, who displeased her husband simply by providing him with a daughter instead of a son, and was sentenced to beheading at the Tower of London. Her headless spirit has been seen drifting through the halls, leading a silent procession of knights and ladies in waiting. Her pale, glowing form moves like a mist, her presence cold and mournful. Margaret Pole was also sentenced to beheading by Henry VIII at the Tower, simply for being the mother of Cardinal Pole, who opposed Henry proclaiming himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The executioner that day was described as a blundering youth who hacked at Margaret's head and shoulders in his botched attempt. Her blood-curdling screams are still heard throughout the tower, a ghostly echo that floats through the stone halls, a chilling presence that refuses to fade. Four, Valley of the Kings, Egypt. Situated on the west bank of the Nile, the Valley of the Kings in Egypt is the principal burial place for New Kingdom pharaohs and nobles. It contains over 60 tombs. When Tutankhamun's tomb was disturbed in 1922, reports of a pharaoh's curse sparked a media frenzy. Illness and misfortune, including the death of George Herbert, one of the leaders of the discovery, led many to believe the tomb should never have been disturbed. Those who have entered the tomb have reported ghostly whispers and shimmering apparitions in the darkened chambers. Faint white figures drift silently past the carvings and sarcophagi, their forms almost translucent, eyes glinting like distant stars. Shadows flicker along the walls, the stale air carrying the faint scent of ancient incense. And the spirits of pharaohs seem to watch silently, their presence lingering as if the tomb had never been disturbed at all. 5. Catacombs of Paris, France. A series of tunnels under the streets of Paris span for miles and miles, filled with the remains of millions of people due to the overfilling of the city's cemeteries. One wrong turn in these catacombs, which stretch 320 kilometers, can find you lost forever among the skulls and bones. The walls are lined with the dead, and shadows seem to shift just beyond your sight. There are numerous stories of explorers who have never returned. One video camera was found by staff in one of the deeper tunnels. The footage showed a sightseeing stroll turn into a terrifying sprint as the camera operator fled from something unseen. The camera was dropped in a dark tunnel, and the video cuts off as the sound of frantic footsteps fades. Sometimes, explorers say, a pale glowing figure drifts just ahead of them, a silent watcher among the skulls, vanishing as soon as you look directly at it. Sinking back into the darker corners of history, something else begins to emerge. Because fear does not stay in one form for long. It shifts. It changes shape. And in Europe and across Britain, it began to take a different form entirely. They weren't the only witches to burn, just the most infamous. But there are others, lesser known trials, darker in some ways than Salem itself. 3 stories that still linger in the quiet corners of history. Pendle Witches, 1612, England. In the hills of Lancashire, 12 people stood trial in 1612. Mostly women, accused of cursing their neighbours, of causing sickness, of using forces no one could see. The evidence came from fear and from a 9-year-old girl testifying against her own family. 10 were found guilty, and they were hanged on Gallows Hill. Even now, locals say the moors feel different in certain weather, as if something remains there, something that never left. Paisley Witch Trials, 1697, Scotland. In a small Scottish town called Paisley, in 1697, a young girl began to suffer violent fits. She blamed witches, and panic, as it so often does, spread quickly. Around her, fear took hold. 7 people were condemned. 6 were executed, and 1 died in prison before ever reaching the gallows. The alleged ringleader, Agnes Naismith, was said to have spoken a curse before her death. A final warning that she and her descendants would not be forgotten. She was buried at a crossroads, with a horseshoe placed above her grave to keep her soul from returning. But the stories say that it did not work. Torsiker Witch Trials, 1675, Sweden. In Sweden, in 1675, something even darker unfolded. The Torsiker witch trials remain one of the largest executions in Scandinavian history. 71 people were beheaded and burned in a single day, accused of attending a witch's Sabbath with the devil himself. Much of the evidence came from children, terrified, confused, and believed without question. Even the priest involved later admitted it had gone too far. But by then, it was already over, and a village had been changed forever. And so, like the vampire stories before them, these tales of witches drift into history, not as myths alone, but as memories of what happens when fear becomes certainty, and when belief becomes something far more dangerous. And when belief becomes something dangerous, it does not simply disappear. It lingers. It settles into places, into land, into memory. Because fear does not only live in stories of witches and unseen forces, it lives in moments where it was felt by many, all at once. On hillsides, in open fields, where voices once shouted and were suddenly silenced. And over time, those places grow quiet again, but not empty. Tonight, we leave behind the shadows of witch trials and step out onto the battlefields of Scotland, where the echoes of war are said to still remain. The hills and fields of Scotland have seen many battles, from the clash of clans to wars fought for king and country. The land has known the weight of conflict for centuries. And in those quiet places where the grass now grows undisturbed, it is said that something still lingers. Echoes of what once happened there, whispers carried on the wind. Tonight, we drift through 3 of the most haunted battlefields in Scotland. Places where the ghosts of war are said to still walk. One, Culloden Moor. Culloden is perhaps the most famous battlefield in Scotland, and for many, one of the most haunted. On April 16th, 1746, the Jacobite rebellion came to its end here, in a battle that lasted less than an hour, but it left devastation behind it. Thousands of Highlanders were killed or wounded on that moor, and many were buried where they fell, beneath the open sky. Now, when you stand on Culloden Moor, it is often quiet, too quiet. Visitors have spoken of distant drum beats echoing across the field, of phantom gunfire carried on the air, and of something else, softer, the sound of weeping. Some say they have seen figures moving through the mist, spectral Highlanders walking slowly across the land, as though the battle never truly ended. And even now there is said to be a heaviness there, as if the ground itself remembers. 2. Bannockburn. At Bannockburn near Stirling, the story is different. Here in 1314, Robert the Bruce led the Scots to a decisive victory against the English. A battle fought not just for survival, but for independence. It is said that before the fight had even begun, the Bruce himself struck down an English knight with a single blow of his axe. A moment that would echo through history. But as with many places touched by violence, the past does not always remain in the past. Those who visit Bannockburn speak of strange experiences, of hearing the distant roar of battle, the clash of metal, the thunder of hooves, as if something unseen is still unfolding just beyond sight. Some have noticed figures standing at the edges of the trees, watching but never approaching. And one visitor described the unsettling feeling of breath close behind them, only to turn and find nothing there at all. And so the question lingers, are the spirits of Bannockburn still standing their ground? Three, Killiecrankie Pass. And finally, the Pass of Killiecrankie, a place of quiet beauty, steeped in shadow and history. In 1689, Jacobite forces clashed with government troops here, and what followed was chaos. Over 2,000 men lost their lives, some cut down in battle, others lost to the rushing waters of the River Garry below. There is one place in particular known as Soldier's Leap, where a redcoat is said to have leapt across the river, a desperate attempt to escape the violence behind him. An impossible distance taken in a moment of fear. Today, the past feels still, but not empty. Walkers and wild campers have reported hearing voices in the darkness, shouts that echo but never reveal their source. Footsteps that seem to follow, always just behind, never quite catching up. And sometimes figures are seen standing silently by the water's edge, watching before fading into nothing. And so, across Scotland, these battlefields remain quiet now, peaceful on the surface, but beneath that stillness, the past lingers. Not as history alone, but as something that continues to echo long after the fighting has ended. And when the echoes of battle finally fade, when the shouting stops and the land grows still again, what remains is not silence, but death. Not as a moment, but as something people have always tried to understand, to control, and to prepare for. Because death comes for everyone. But what happens after has never been agreed upon. And so, across history, people have created rituals. Some peaceful, some beautiful, and some deeply unsettling. Viking ship burials, Scandinavia, 700s to 1000s. In the cold northern lands of Scandinavia, the dead were not always laid quietly into the earth. For some, death was only the beginning of a journey, and they would not travel alone. Viking nobles, warriors of status and power, were sometimes sent into the afterlife aboard ships. Vessels that had once carried them across dark seas, now prepared to carry them somewhere beyond this world. But these burials were not always solitary. It is said that servants, animals, and sometimes even wives were chosen to accompany them, not in life, but in death. A 10th century traveller, An Arab observer named Ibn Fadlan described one such ritual. A slave girl selected to follow her master. She was given drink, encouraged to sing, to appear willing. But beneath it all, there was no escape. When the time came, she was led to the ship, and there, in the flickering light of ritual and fire, her life was taken, so that she might lie beside her lord as the vessel was set alight, drifting, burning, carrying them both into the unknown. As the flames rose into the dark sky, it was believed that this was not an ending, but a passage. Sky burials, Tibet. Far from the northern seas, high in the mountains of Tibet, death is approached very differently. Here the body is not preserved, it is not hidden away, it is returned to the world. In what is known as a sky burial, the dead are taken to sacred, open places. Mountain tops, quiet and vast, where the sky feels close enough to touch. There, the body is prepared, not with ceremony alone, but with purpose. Monks carefully break it down, cutting, separating, reducing it to something that can be offered. Bones are crushed, flesh is laid out, and then the birds come. Vultures circling above, descending in silence, to take what remains, to carry it back into nature, to complete a cycle rather than resist it. To an outsider, it can seem difficult to witness, even disturbing. But within the belief itself, there is no fear, only acceptance. A quiet understanding that the body is no longer needed, and that even in death, it can still give something back. Victorian post-mortem photography, UK and USA, 1800s. In a very different setting, there is a quieter kind of ritual. One that did not involve fire or sky or open land, but something far more still. In the 19th century, as photography became more common, it also became something else. A way to hold on to those who had been lost. For many families, photographs were rare, expensive, sometimes never taken at all during life. And so when death came, it became the only opportunity. The dead were carefully arranged, positioned, sometimes seated upright, supported by hidden stands, sometimes laid gently as though they were only sleeping. In some cases, eyes were painted onto closed eyelids, giving the illusion of life where none remained. Families would gather beside them, pose beside them, capture one final image together, not as something strange, but as something precious, a memory held in stillness, a moment where death was made to look almost peaceful. And so across time and across the world, death has never been treated the same way twice. Sometimes feared, sometimes accepted, sometimes transformed into something else entirely, but always shaped by the living. Because in the end, these rituals were never just about the dead. They were about those left behind, trying to understand what cannot be explained. And yet, even with all of this care, all of this ritual, all the ways people have tried to shape death into something meaningful, something understood, there are moments scattered quietly throughout history where death does not follow any pattern at all, where it does not arrive with ceremony or purpose or even reason. Moments where it comes suddenly, strangely, in ways that no ritual could ever prepare for, and no belief could fully explain. And it is in these moments that death becomes something else entirely, not something guided or accepted, but something deeply and unsettlingly bizarre. History is filled with the familiar shapes of death, woven through time and patterns we almost come to expect. War stretching across distant fields, plague moving silently through crowded streets, and executions carried out in the shadows of power and fear. And yet, every so often, there are moments where death does not follow these patterns, where it arrives in ways so strange, so unexpected, that the story itself lingers far longer than the life that came before it. These are three of the most bizarre and unsettling deaths ever recorded. In England in the year 1327, a king found himself no longer surrounded by the grandeur of the court, but confined instead within the cold, unmoving walls of Berkeley Castle. Edward II had been overthrown, betrayed not by distant enemies, but by those closest to him. His Queen Isabella, and the man who stood beside her, Roger Mortimer. The castle, vast and silent, became his final world. Its thick stone corridors holding the chill of late nights and the weight of unspoken things. Its narrow spaces offering no comfort, no escape, and no sense of what might come next. For months he remained there, removed from everything he had once known, until quietly and without ceremony, word spread that the king was dead. The explanation given was simple, almost dismissive. Illness, nothing more. But stories have a way of growing in the dark, and what followed was far from simple. It was said that under the cover of night, men entered his chamber, not with blades or weapons that would leave visible marks, but with something far more deliberate. Something designed to leave no trace upon the body, and yet ensure nothing within could survive. A heated iron brought to a terrible temperature, used in such a way that the outside remained untouched, while the inside was utterly destroyed. There was no proof, no confirmation, nothing that could ever fully separate truth from rumour. And yet the story endured, passing quietly through generations, becoming one of the most infamous and unsettling tales of a royal death, lingering like the cold air of the castle itself, refusing to fade. Centuries earlier, in the rugged and open lands of Scotland, where the wind moved freely across hills and coastline, a Viking earl rode on horseback, carrying with him the certainty of victory. Sigurd had defeated his enemy in battle, his power firmly established, his dominance unquestioned. And in a display that was as much a warning as it was a symbol of triumph, he took the severed head of the man he had killed and fastened it to his saddle. It was a message, clear and unmistakable, to any who might dare to challenge him. A sign of strength, of control, of finality. As he rode across the land, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath him, the air moving past, the world continuing as it always had, the head moved with him, swaying gently with each step, almost unnoticed, just another part of the journey. But with each movement, something small began to happen. Something so minor it might have been ignored entirely. The brushing of the head against his leg, the faintest contact repeated again and again. And then a tooth, catching the skin, leaving behind a cut so slight it barely seemed worth attention. It was nothing at first. But time has a way of changing small things into something far more serious. And what began as a minor wound slowly became something else entirely. As infection took hold, unseen and unstoppable. Days passed, and the victorious Earl who had walked away from battle unharmed found himself growing weaker, his strength fading not from any enemy still living, but from the lingering trace of the one he had already defeated. And in the end, it was not the clash of weapons or the chaos of war that claimed him, but the quiet, almost absurd consequence of a single moment, a final, unintended act of revenge from beyond the grave. And in ancient Greece, far removed from battlefields and castles, in a world shaped instead by thought, discussion, and philosophy, another man met his end in a way that seemed almost impossible to believe. Chrysippus was known for his intellect, for his ideas, for the careful and measured way he understood the world around him. A man whose life was built upon reason and reflection. And yet it was not a great philosophical question, nor a moment of deep contemplation that brought about his death, but something far simpler, far more ordinary. One day he noticed a donkey nearby, quietly eating his figs. An unremarkable scene, something that might pass without thought. And yet, for reasons no one could fully explain, Chrysippus found it overwhelmingly amusing. The image, the absurdity of it, took hold of him in a way that seemed to grow rather than fade. And as his laughter built, he called out to a servant, his voice already unsteady, and told them through laughter to give the donkey wine as well. And as the animal drank, as the moment became stranger, more surreal, more ridiculous in its simplicity, Chrysippus continued to laugh, the sound carrying on, growing beyond control, beyond reason, until it became something else entirely. Breath became difficult, the body struggling against something it could not quite manage. And still the laughter continued, unstoppable, until, without warning, it simply ended.
A life spent in the pursuit of understanding, brought to a close not by conflict or illness, but by a moment of uncontrollable, overwhelming laughter, so intense that it could not be survived. Three lives, separated by time, by place, and by purpose. A king, a warrior, and a philosopher, each meeting their end in ways that no one could have predicted, no one could have planned for, and perhaps no one could fully understand. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all. Not that death comes, as it always does, but that sometimes it arrives in ways that feel almost unreal, as though the world itself has briefly slipped away from logic, leaving behind only stories that continue to echo long after they should have faded.
Even in those strange and unsettling moments where death seems to slip beyond reason, it does not always end. In some places, the story does not stop at the moment of death. Something remains. It settles into the walls, into the ground, into the very air itself, until what is left behind is no longer just memory, but something that can still be felt, still be heard, sometimes even seen. Few places carry this feeling more strongly than Scotland. A land of ancient stone and drifting mist, of castles that rise from the earth as though they have always belonged there, and moors that stretch endlessly beneath low, heavy skies. Here, history does not feel distant, but close enough to brush against. And in the quiet, there is often the sense that something is still watching. Scotland is not only shaped by its past, but by what refuses to fade from it. From violent presences that strike without warning, to silent figures that remain just beyond sight. These are some of the most unsettling ghost stories Scotland has to offer. In the heart of Edinburgh, where narrow streets twist between old stone buildings, and the past presses in from every side, lies Greyfriars Kirkyard, a place where the air feels heavier than it should, where the silence stretches just a little too far, and where one presence in particular has never truly been at rest. Sir George Mackenzie, a 17th century judge, remembered not for fairness, but for cruelty. A man so feared in life that even now, centuries later, his name carries unease. They called him Bloody Mackenzie, and whatever lies buried with him is said to be anything but still. In the 1990s, a man broke into his mausoleum, forcing his way inside and disturbing what had long been sealed. From that moment on, something changed. Visitors began to leave with scratches they could not explain, bruises that had not been there before. Some spoke of a sudden, overwhelming force, as though something unseen had struck them. Others simply collapsed, their bodies giving way without warning. More than 500 incidents followed, each one adding to the same growing sense of fear. Eventually, the tomb was sealed, locked and closed to the public once more. There are those who will take you there, guiding you into the place where so many have felt something reach out from the dark. A place where people still hesitate before stepping too close. Far from the city, rising from the quiet landscape of Angus, stands Glam's castle. Tall and still, its towers reach high into the sky. Often called the most haunted castle in Scotland, it is a place where history has settled deeply into every stone. Among the many stories tied to it, one feels colder than the rest. A story not of anger, but of sorrow. It is said that a child was born within the castle walls, one so terribly deformed that she was hidden away from the world, kept from sight, locked behind a door no one would speak of. Her existence reduced to silence, her life confined to darkness. Time passed, but silence does not always remain silent. Even now, people speak of hearing soft sobbing echoing through empty corridors, a quiet, broken sound that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some have seen her, just for a moment, a pale figure at a window, a small shape watching from the dark, still and unmoving, gone the instant you tried to be certain. The castle does not confirm the story, but it does not deny it either. It holds its secrets close, and somewhere within it, perhaps a room that was never meant to be found. Deep into Aberdeenshire, where the land opens wide and quiet, stands Ward Hill Castle, a place where the past does not announce itself, but waits patiently. Here the presence is not heard in footsteps or seen crossing empty rooms. It does not move in ways you would expect. Instead, it appears only in reflections. They call her the Green Lady, a figure glimpsed not directly, but through mirrors, through glass, through the spaces where reality should remain certain. People have caught sight of her standing just behind them, close enough to feel, close enough to believe for a moment that someone is there. But when they turn, there is nothing. Staff have left, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Guests describe the same quiet awareness that they are not alone, even in an empty room. One man, after taking a photograph, later saw something he could not explain. A figure standing just behind him, so close it should have been impossible to miss. He had been alone, he was certain of it, and still there she was, watching. The Green Lady does not chase. She does not call out. She does not need to make herself known. She simply waits and watches. And in that stillness, there is something far more unsettling than any sound in the dark. Because in places like these, death does not always mark an ending. Sometimes it is only the beginning of something that refuses to leave. And if something can remain, if it can settle quietly into the spaces we move through, then perhaps it does not always stay there. Sometimes it follows, not in ways easily seen, but in moments captured without thought, in fragments of time held still, where something unnoticed reveals itself later. A shape that doesn't belong, a presence that wasn't there, as though whatever lingers has found a way to be seen. look closely enough at certain moments, and it can begin to feel as though something is looking back. Not everything that is captured is understood, and not everything that appears in an image was ever truly there. At least, not in any ordinary sense. There are occasions, rare, quiet, and often dismissed at first, where something unintended finds its way into a photograph. Something unnoticed in the moment. Something that only reveals itself later. When the light has faded and the world has grown still. These are not stories built on exaggeration or invention, but on fragments of reality. Moments preserved exactly as they were, with one small, impossible detail. And once that detail is seen, it becomes very difficult to look away. In the mid-1990s, in the small market town of Wem, a fire began to spread through the old town hall. The building, already aged and worn by time, stood little chance against it. Flames moved quickly through the structure, feeding on timber and dry air, casting a flickering glow across the surrounding streets as people gathered at a distance, watching in uneasy silence. Among those watching was a photographer, standing far away enough to be safe, close enough to capture the moment. The image, when taken, seemed unremarkable. Just fire, smoke, the slow collapse of something familiar. It was only later, when the photograph was examined more closely, that something else became visible. Within the doorway, framed by flame and shadow, stood the shape of a child. Small, still, unmoving despite the chaos surrounding it. The outline was clear enough to recognize a young girl, her clothing not belonging to the present, her form untouched by the fire that consumed everything around her. There had been no children inside the building. No one had entered. No one had stood in that doorway. And yet she remained there, captured in a single moment that could not be repeated nor explained. Some began to speak of an older story, of a girl named Jane, said to have been responsible for a fire centuries earlier, a name that had never quite faded from local memory. Whether memory shaped the image, or the image gave form to something already remembered, no one could say. Only that, for a brief moment, something stood in the flames and did not burn. Decades earlier, within the quiet, ordered space of the Queen's house, a very different moment was unfolding. The building itself, elegant and symmetrical, had stood for centuries. Its white walls and long corridors carrying a stillness that seemed almost untouched by time. At its centre, a staircase, spiraling upward in perfect balance, each step worn smooth by years of passing footsteps, each curve leading gently out of sight. It was here that a photograph was taken, not of anything unusual, not of anything intended to be remarkable, but simply of the staircase itself. Empty, quiet, still. At least that was how it appeared. When the image was later developed, something had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly as the eye adjusted, as the mind began to notice what should not have been there. On the stairs, part way between one level and the next, was a figure. Its form indistinct at first, then gradually clearer. A presence moving upward, one hand then another, resting against the railing as though climbing. There had been no one else in the building at the time. No movement, no sound. And yet the figure seemed caught in motion, as though it had been there all along, passing silently through a space that was never truly empty. Those who have stood at the base of the staircase sometimes describe a feeling difficult to name, as though the air itself holds something unseen, something that lingers just beyond perception, watching, waiting, or simply continuing a journey that never came to an end. And then, earlier still, just after the First World War, a group of men gathered for a photograph. Members of the Royal Air Force, standing together in quiet formation, their expressions subdued, their posture formal, as though aware that the moment being captured carried more weight than most. It was meant to be a simple photograph, a record, a memory, nothing more. But something about it would soon draw attention. Not immediately, not in the moment it was taken, but afterwards, when the image was studied more carefully. Among the faces, aligned in neat rows, there appeared another, faint but unmistakable, a man standing just behind the others, his expression calm, his presence no different from those around him, except for one detail. He should not have been there. He had died only days before, his absence already felt, his funeral held on the very day the photograph was taken. And yet somehow he appeared among them, as though he had simply stepped back into place, as though nothing had changed at all. Those who knew him recognized him instantly. There was no hesitation, no doubt. Only a quiet, shared understanding that something had been captured, something that did not belong to the living moment, but had found its way into it nonetheless. Moments like these do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with warning, and they rarely offer explanation. They exist quietly, within ordinary places, within ordinary seconds, until something shifts. And what was once unseen becomes impossible to ignore. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is not that these moments have happened, but that they may be happening still, unnoticed, unrecorded, or waiting to be seen. As summer starts to fade and the weather turns colder, I always find my mind drifting to dark woods, where the orange leaves fall slowly and a shadowy figure glides along the crispy floor between the tall trees. The fascinating folktale of the evil witch that lives among the shadows and afflicts villagers with curses and spells has been told for centuries, passing down the warning from generation to generation. And as the world grows quieter at night, those old warnings don't always fade. Sometimes they feel closer. These are three of the best and most terrifying tales of real witches from history. We begin in the candlelit streets of Paris. In 17th century France, Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, was a professional fortune teller, poison maker, and sorcerer. She was accused of creating poisons to kill thousands of people, summoning demons, and even sacrificing infants during black masses for her wealthy clients. Her involvement in the infamous Affair of the Poisons, where a number of prominent members of the aristocracy were implicated and sentenced on charges of poisoning and witchcraft, shocked Paris. And when her crimes were uncovered, she was burned alive in 1680. But she fought and struggled the whole way to her death, fighting the priest and pushing away the hay that would be lit to burn her. And yet, even in death, some whispered that her presence never truly left the city that feared her. But not all witches lived in the darkness of cities. Some were born where the land itself feels older than memory. Born in a cave in 16th century England, Ursula Southdale, better known as Mother Shipton, was rumoured to be the child of a demon. Twisted and deformed, she became a feared prophetess. So big was her fame as a supposed witch, claims were made that her eerie predictions included the Great Fire of London and even the defeat of the Spanish Armada, as tales and folklore grew around her. She was accused of sorcery against the village folk, magically casting chamber pots onto the heads of those who mocked her, and making a thief dance through the village square, singing about her crimes. To this day, her cave and the petrifying well, where objects turn to stone in the dripping waters, draw visitors who claim it is haunted by many ghosts, including the spirit of Mother Shipton herself. And in the stillness of that cave, it is said time doesn't quite behave the way it should. And far from England, beyond even the edges of mapped lands, the forests changed their rules entirely. Unlike the others, Baba Yaga comes from the Eastern European folklore, but her legend is so dark, it's as if she could be real. She lives deep in the forest, in a hut that stands on chicken legs, flying through the night in a giant mortar and pestle, sweeping away her tracks with a broom. She lures travellers, especially children, before devouring them. Some say she can be persuaded to help you, but only if you face her without fear, performing tasks in specific ways to avoid her grasp. Even today, wandering through a misty forest in Eastern Europe, many swear they can feel her gaze from the shadows, waiting to see if you'll pass her test or become her next meal. And in those woods, silence is never truly empty. Three witches from history, three stories that still linger in old places and old memories. A poisoner in Paris, a prophetess born in stone, and something that waits in the deep forest. And as the night settles in and the world grows quieter again, it's easy to wonder what might still be watching just out of sight.